Hi, I'm Jerod Brennan. I'm an identity strategy and solutions advisor with SailPoint. And I've worked in a number of roles throughout my career. I've had enterprise roles, I've had consulting roles. Now I'm on the vendor side. And I put together this talk to tie a lot of that information together to help organizations understand how to harden their identity infrastructure by bringing the concept of threat modeling to bear specifically on identity. Good starting point is to just chew on this question for a sec. Which parts of your business rely on your identity infrastructure? If I'm talking pure play security, I can look at some of the trends that we've seen around data breach activity over the years. And I guarantee as you dig deeper, you'll find that compromised identities are at the core of virtually every single breach that's making the news. And then abuse of the privilege assigned to those identities. And because identity as a concept is so pervasive throughout how our organizations operate, there's tremendous value in figuring out how to harden that in a way that enables a business to do what they do without enabling attackers to get in when they shouldn't. Just think about this at a high level. Provisioning of new entitlements to an identity. And let's take a new hire, for example, right? If somebody gets hired at your organization, they're going to get at a minimum a domain account and an email address. Now, realistically, they're going to get a lot more than that. But even if they're not on the domain, they're going to get creds into the HR, the payroll, the benefit system, so that they can check their taxes, right? They can update their benefits once a year. Everybody in your company has an identity, and they're going to have access to something. Now, those domain accounts are going to give them access to a lot of things. Maybe their laptop, internal file shares like SharePoint, or SharePoint, right? The wireless network, databases, on-prem apps. There's a lot of stuff that you're going to link back to traditionally Active Directory. And if you're federating, then you may be giving them access to some cloud apps as soon as they get access to that on-prem directory. And even if it's just like SaaS apps, or if it's infrastructure, if it's AWS, if it's Azure, they're going to have a login. And if that login isn't their domain account, it's going to be a native account. It might be where they use their email address as the username, although the password is going to vary from one platform to the next. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about your identity infrastructure at a very high level. And that's just flesh and blood. That's not even like service accounts or RPA, right? Robotic process automation accounts, or customer accounts, right? I'm just talking employees. So understanding kind of that flow is step one. And if you ask yourself, well, do we have any parts of our business that don't need identity, that don't rely on the identity infrastructure? You may have some components out that are maybe independent of this, but I have a hunch it's going to be a much smaller subset than what identity touches. And so you've got some choices to make, right? You've got to determine, well, where am I going to start? What path am I going to follow to clean all this up? And I want to give you some of that here today. When I talk about identity, I talk in terms of identity governance and administration. So this is more than just IAM, right? Your traditional identity and access management. This is giving people access to the things they need in order to do their job, making sure that access is appropriate at any given time, and taking access away when they don't need it. That the concept of governance really gets around making sure that all the things that you're doing are appropriate. And as you're applying threat modeling to hardening your infrastructure, you're going to be making changes. You're going to be reducing what people have access to, right? The number of entitlements they have, the number of systems where they even have accounts. Governance comes into play there because you want to make sure that you're not doing something that's going to keep somebody from doing their job. I'm a big fan of the Identity Defined Security Alliance as a vendor agnostic resource for figuring this identity stuff out. If you're not familiar with the IDSA, they're kind of like OWASP. If you're AppSec, right? The Open Web Application Security Project has been around for decades. The IDSA has only been around for a few years, and they're a blend of, there are a lot of vendor organizations that have contributed content based on what they're seeing in the field and what their technology does. And by a lot, I mean over 20 different vendor organizations have said, this is what identity looks like from our side. And there's also a customer advisory board that includes practitioners and consultants to take all that information and say, okay, now that we've got all this data, what should people be doing regardless of the technology? What should people be doing if they're covering all of their identity things? And what the IDSA has done is drafted an identity-defined security framework that includes just under 30 best practices that map to use cases and reference architectures to help answer that question. It's freely available to download from this website. And they have a blog that helps make the connection between what we see in practice and how their framework applies. And I wanted to share some things there before we get into the threat modeling piece. So they've got 3 sections in that blog entry I just mentioned. They talk about challenges with identities, challenges with access and privilege, and then challenges with third parties, because all of that is in scope for this identity stuff. When they look at their population, and they tend to go out and survey the market, right? Larger companies, 1,000 users at a minimum, usually organizations with 10,000 or more. And they ask the leaders, the people actually doing this stuff day to day, what's changed? What does your environment look like? And they look like at organizations, over half the organizations they interviewed said that the number of identities that they're having to manage has increased more than 5-fold over the past 10 years. And I know from my own enterprise days, I had to fight for every penny of budget and every headcount on my team over and over and over. And as more and more responsibility came our way, that didn't automatically mean we got more budget or we got more people. It just meant we had to get more creative about how we manage that environment. And in the identity space, I have a hunch, whether it's through organic growth, whether it's merger acquisition, that you're seeing some of the same, that you're managing more identities, but at the same time, all these additional identities result in stale accounts that nobody's using anymore, but nobody knows to turn them off. Complexity is the enemy of security. And as you're taking on more and more, you're adding complexity to your environment. That complexity, if you look at the number of passwords we're asking users to remember, some of these organizations had nearly 200 separate accounts that people were using to log in and do their jobs. And when I look at password security, and we say, why are people using stupid, easy to remember passwords? It's because we're making it too complex for them to do their jobs. It's because we're creating all these disconnected systems, and they've got to have a way to get in the system and prove that they are who they say they are. And the numbers are real. I mean, this isn't hyperbole. This isn't made up. This is what they're finding when they go out and talk to people and say, hey, what's it look like in your environment? And when we look at it from a threat perspective, they're finding that almost every single attack against these organizations, every single threat requires some sort of human interaction, which is why identities and the accounts associated with those identities are such high value targets. I've done a lot of pen testing over the years, and privilege escalation and lateral movement are just beat into me that that's what you do when you pop a box, right? You establish persistence, give yourself the highest level of privilege you can on that box, and then try to grab another one so that even if they find you on the one, you're still in. You can still do what you're doing. Marriott, unfortunately, with their publicly disclosed data breach, had an attacker on their network for 4 years before they caught them. 4 years. And I look at that and say, God, that's ridiculous. How does that happen? Because the attacker knew how to get in, establish that persistence, and then act like they belonged there, that their account looked like it was doing what it should be doing. And we're seeing that, the vast majority of these breaches and just attacks in general, successful or not, are going after privileged accounts, and abuse of those privileged accounts, whether it's by an attacker or by an insider, is one of the top 3 patterns that shows up in the DBIR from Verizon. And then, of course, like I said, with lateral movement, once somebody's in, they're going to try to get around. And that's just the corporate accounts, right? Now that we're extending our trust to these third parties, we're crossing our fingers and hoping they're doing the same. And those third parties, you can have nearly 200 third parties that you're sharing, you're letting log into your stuff every week, with nearly 3 times that the number of third parties who somebody at your organization is sharing data with, is giving sensitive data to. All of this comes back to your identity infrastructure. If you don't have preventative controls in place, and if you're not monitoring for aberrant behavior, right, potential misuse, then you quickly become one of these statistics. The IDSA, in their most recent paper, Identity Security Work in Progress, hired a research firm to go out and talk to over 500, they call them qualified professionals. So this is executives, individual contributors, and managers who are actually doing identity on a day-to-day basis. And again, that broad spectrum, like a dozen different industries, and then some accounts ranging anywhere from 1,000 employees to they've got a whole category of 10,000 and up. And these are the patterns that these people shared anonymously with the research firm to say, yeah, this is what we're seeing. 94%, virtually every single one of them who they talked to said, yeah, we had a breach and identity was part of the problem. And of that 94, well, of the entire population, 79%, and said it happened within the last 2 years. So this isn't some trend that we're moving away from. It's still very much an active, real thing. And the overwhelming majority, 99% of these people, said that we could have prevented it. Had we done something different on the front end, this could have been stopped. And I don't know who that 1% is, right? I got to think that, in my experience, everything's preventable from a security perspective, except for that, black swan scenario. But I'm not here to judge, right? I'll just leave that as is. The last stat I wanted to share from that report is that they took a look at these organizations and asked them to categorize themselves as either proactive, forward thinking, or reactive. And the proactive organizations saw an impact, or even a breach, to the tune of 25% less than the number of organizations who classified themselves as reactive. And that concept comes at no surprise. If you do security well on the front end, the likelihood of bad things happening goes way down. But to me, the number of organizations, right, the disparity between we decided to do something on the front end versus, yeah, we just wait until we see something publicly disclosed and then go into scramble mode. It was a pretty big gap. Highly recommend you check out this report and that you use it internally as you're sharing this information, because it can be overwhelming. And I know it can be doom and gloom and, oh, those numbers are terrible. How will we ever get ahead of it? That's not the case. No, when you apply this concept of threat modeling with a specific focus to your identity infrastructure, you can have a measurable positive impact on whether or not you become one of those statistics. And when I say this concept of threat modeling, it's about applying a very deliberate, systematic approach, a repeatable process toward identifying threats and attackers and putting safeguards in place that you can come back to again and again and track improvement and show people that, yeah, we're making changes for the better. And this isn't compliance, right? Because if you go out and look at publicly disclosed data breaches, the number of compliant organizations that have ended up on these lists is way too high. And the number of compliant organizations that don't even realize they've been compromised yet is the bigger concern. Compliance is binary, right? We're either doing it or we're not doing it. But when you bring threat modeling into play, you're adding a level of quality to your process, right? Now it's not one or zero, right? It's all or nothing. No, this is how deep we're going and how well we're doing at tracking all of this. Carnegie Mellon's Software Engineering Institute has a write-up on a dozen different threat modeling methodologies that you can use. I've got a link to it here at the end of the presentation. I'm not covering all of these today, but I do want to cover two of them to help you get started, although you may want to check out that article after you get your feet under you. The two most common threat modeling methodologies you're going to hear about in the space are Stride and Dread. They both came out of the Microsoft space. They're both not being maintained as kind of an active discipline or practice, but they're still both pretty relevant. They're pretty active in the industry. A lot of folks are using them today, and they take slightly different approaches to threat modeling. Both of them use mnemonics. So Stride stands for spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And when you're identifying a threat and running it through this process, Stride is saying, I want you to answer these 6 questions about the threat. Where does it fall? And Dread takes more of an impact-based approach to say, with these threats, how bad are they? Damage, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, discoverability. And so either methodology is taking this idea of, hey, there's a bad thing that we have to do something about, and putting some values to it, putting some criteria that you can measure to say, because this one is more significant than that one, we're going to take action on this one first. And so the point of the two methodologies is to help you do just that, is to help you put some prioritization around what you do so that you're not spinning your wheels, and most importantly, so you're not spending time on the minutia and spending time on things that can have the most significant impact to your organization. When you apply the threat modeling process, there's a simple 4-step process that you'll go through, regardless of which methodology you use. Model the system, find the threats, address the threats, and validate. And this is what I want to go into at this point. I want to talk about tools and techniques that you can use at each of these phases, at each step along the way, to help you build out that repeatable process. So let's start with step 1, modeling your system. Here, the system is your identity infrastructure. So how do you do that? How do you model your identity infrastructure? Well, it helps if you know where your identities can do things, right? We talked about identities have access to resources. Well, the access is usually granted through an account, and the level of access, the specifics of what they can do, are all the entitlements associated with those accounts. But from an identity governance perspective, you got to step back and take it one layer higher. I'm not just looking at accounts. I'm looking at flesh and blood people. Me, Jerod, right? I, at the company I work for, have multiple accounts, and I have different entitlements in all these systems where these accounts have access. But I'm one person, and all of those accounts have there's a one-to-many relationship between Jerod, the identity, and the accounts that Jerod has. So in order to kind of reverse engineer that mapping of identity to accounts, you've got to figure out where all of your authentication stores are and start creating this like an identity warehouse, right? You need some mapping to say this person has access to all these things. And I say that's at a corporate level, right? That might be an employee, that might be a contractor. But now with the rise of especially robotic process automation becoming so ridiculously popular, there are all these non-human accounts that don't map back to a flesh and blood person, although you might say that Jerod is the one responsible for an RPA account. So there may be an association between a human and a non-human account. That's a good first step, is identifying all those directories. Also looking at your third parties, your customers, right? Don't exclude those apps or systems because they're not employees. Again, if it's an identity, if it's a person needing access to a thing, you want to capture that information somewhere. So there's a little bit of legwork, a little bit of investigation here. When you're looking for authentication stores, you might look at larger systems or platforms. Anything as a service would be your cloud authentication stores. You're going to have authentication stores on-prem that more often than not are going to be an LDAP directory or a database. Ideally, you're going to be moving a lot of things toward a single LDAP store. Again, complexity versus simplicity here. But start by trying to just put that list together. And in order to help you put that list together, go into the process with a concept of the joiner, mover, leaver life cycle. In the identity space, this is a pretty common model. You'll come across it at some point if you haven't already. And these are the events that result in state changes with your identity, right? If I don't have a relationship with an organization today, and then I sign up somewhere and they say, okay, Jerod, you as a person have this relationship. Now we need to start giving you accounts and giving those accounts entitlements. That initial sign up is a joiner event. And it's from a business process standpoint, it's going to trigger all the technical changes that happen to enable me to have access to things. Now, over time, those relationships inevitably change. In the employee space, this is, commonplace. People get promoted, people move to a different department, people go on long-term maternity, paternity, disability leave. People retire, but still need access to certain things in order to do their jobs. Those mover events still need to be identified and tracked, but they're much more complex to automate. You can automate a joiner event to some extent, but the mover events require a little more delicacy, a little more intricacy. And then at some point, there's a leaver event when someone is no longer engaged with the organization. If I'm not there anymore and you need to take my access away, well, you need to know where I have access. You need to have that one-to-many mapping defined, because when that leaver event happens, if I'm leaving on unfriendly terms, the reality of human nature is sometimes people are hot-headed, sometimes people make decisions that they'll regret later on, but those decisions can have damage. Decisions like deleting an entire organization's cloud storage account. Look that story up. That's a fairly recent story that is very concerning. So look at your authentication stores within that identity governance lifecycle, because you want an idea of when things change. And how do you collect this information? If your organization has a CMDB, start there. It's going to have most of what you need if you've got a team doing more like service management and asset management. Now, they may have collected the vast majority of this information already. You'll want to spend some time looking at, excuse me, third-party relationships, which include not just vendors you're working with, but even like software as a service apps that people are using. You can find a lot of this with your procurement, your accounts payable teams. If you sit down with them and say, who are we paying monthly bills to, right? Who are we paying bills? And how do I know whether or not that relationship comes with access, with login to a website somewhere, or if we're granting those people the ability to log into our stuff? They'll know. So build that relationship with your procurement team, your AP team. You can also use technology like a CASB, a Cloud Access Security Broker. You can look at, heck, even if you've got a layer 7 firewall and you're looking at application traffic for login activity, right? You've got technology deployed today that will help you round out the data you get from your AP and procurement team, that will help you identify that shadow IT, especially if you're not paying for it. It's one thing to go say, who are we paying each month? But it's another thing to say, where are people uploading data, but we don't have a business relationship. We don't have a contract. They're just doing it. And what I found, and this is crazy simple, but it works. Reach out to people, non-technical end users, and ask them a very specific question here. What websites do you log into in order to do your job? I guarantee every single person at your organization can answer that question, because it's not technical, it's not overly complex, and they all know what their job is, right? You don't. That's not your job. Your job is to help them secure it. But if you reach out to these line of business end users, that will help fill the gaps in where these other two tools may be lacking. And especially now that we've had such a monumental shift to remote work, you may find that some of that collaboration is happening more quickly as people are just signing up and using things without going through AP without going through procurement, with the stuff that they're all connecting to over the internet that doesn't necessarily have, you don't have visibility into the network traffic. So use that non-technical approach, and on your network, right? Do an Nmap scan. Look for your directories. LDAP listens on 389 and 636 if it's LDAP-S, right? Secure. And then HTTP and HTTPS, our web apps, are going to have a login page. So traditionally, you're going to find them at 80 and 443, but all the admin consoles, all the non-standard ports, the development teams and the infrastructure teams have enabled for administration or for testing. 8080, 8443 are common, but they're not exclusive. So, and this is above and beyond like your, if you've got VNC, if you've got secure shell, right? Well, all the other protocols, but you're looking for where can people log in? And you can get that with Nmap, and Nmap remains one of the most useful free tools in the InfoSec space today. So once you do that step one, right, you're modeling your identity infrastructure, you're looking at your joiner, mover, leaver workflows, you're looking at all the places that people have accounts and entitlements, mapping that back to identities. Then you're ready to shift your attention to the threats. And when it comes to identifying threats that you should consider, right, threats that you should evaluate as part of your process, privacyrights.org has maintained a chronology of publicly disclosed data breaches for years. They have breaches dating from 2005 to 2019. Who was compromised? What do we know about it? How many records? And they stopped maintaining the database in October of 2019 with a promise that they'll get back to it. But you can take all of that years and years of data that they've collected and look at the aggregate that comes out each year from the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, where they identify trends and patterns based on data breaches, some of which may not have been publicly disclosed. Also take a look at Have I Been Pwned from Troy Hunt. To date, Have I Been Pwned has nearly 10 billion accounts in their database. So going out there and looking at what resources has Troy incorporated into that tool is going to give you an idea to kind of follow the trail, follow the breadcrumbs back to that data breach. And if it ended up in Have I Been Pwned, can we get back to root cause? What's been publicly disclosed about it? And then I'd also look at Google News. I've got some alerts set up. They're just daily emails of keywords. A quick search on the keyword data breach, or even just go out there at a point in time and look. You've got a lot of information you can tap into about publicly disclosed data breaches. Go back and look at what were the root causes of these breaches. What do we know about how the attackers got in, and build that into your threat modeling exercises. You should also download NIST Special Publication 830 Rev 1, their guide for conducting risk assessments, even if it's only for Appendices D and E. Appendix D outlines a number of threat sources, and Appendix E outlines a number of threat events. It's almost like a checklist, right? Copy paste over into your threat modeling documents, right? And you've got a huge head start. You're not having to sit in a room and just come up with stuff out of thin air. No, these people have done a lot of research over the years, and they're giving you a lot of information to help you get started. And what I really like about the NIST doc is, from a technical standpoint, a technologist tends to go right down into the weeds, right? I want to look at the vulnerabilities on the system. Give me the vulnscan reports. Let me look at the criticals that have publicly disclosed exploit code, right? But NIST breaks down these threats into 3 different categories, right? There's the information system level, but then there's also like the business process level, right? Are your users doing anything in their day-to-day job that if that process is disrupted, or just by the nature of that process, or is there a body or population of threats that are relevant to what they're doing and how they're doing it? And then at the organization level, there are another family of threats. Like take mergers and acquisitions. If you've ever been involved in an M&A, whether you've been at a company that's been acquired, you've been the company doing the acquisition, you've done consulting around that. If you have two companies that have grown up independently of one another, and suddenly all of their identities need to be able to work together, all these systems and apps need to talk to each other, you might find it becomes least common denominator until we can figure it out. I did consulting once for a company that had their stuff together, right? Their Active Directory security posture was actually pretty tight. And they were bringing in a very immature company from a technology standpoint. And in order for this company to continue operating, the team that was doing it well had to loosen and lighten their controls, right? They had to let up on what they were doing. Otherwise, the company couldn't make money. And that money pays for the tools, it pays for the budget, it pays salaries. So that's a different kind of threat than a very specific, like a SQL injection attack, right? It's very different, but that's the value that when you look at the NIST doc, the value of looking at holistically at this doc can give you. It also points out a distinction between adversarial threats and non-adversarial threats, because sometimes stuff is just accidental, right? If somebody's using an account that's over entitled, or a privileged account that has way too many privileges, that's not necessarily intentional, but the damage is still going to be just as bad if an attacker gets their hands on that account. So look at this NIST document. And I've got a presentation I've done a number of times called Hacking Identity, where I go into a lot more detail about pen testing and tools and techniques that I would use as an attacker and people a lot smarter than me would use to get in within 15 minutes on day one. And it's always going after creds. I mean, it's not overly complicated exploits. It's a lot of it's password spraying. I do a lot of OSINT gathering and try to gather information that might help me later on. But I've got a link to this talk later on if you want some very specific kind of red team attacker details. I've got a lot in that resource as well. So once you've done that, you understand your environment, you're looking at the threats that are relevant. Now you need to say, well, what are we going to do about them, right? What steps are we going to take to address these threats? And one of the biggest challenges is getting this stuff out of your head and onto paper so that it makes sense, right? Because even if you just go through those two NIST appendices, it can be overwhelming. So how do you break that complexity down into simple like data sets or collections of elements that you can step back and say, yeah, we need to act here and we're okay over there. I use Xmind. I know FreeMind is a good tool in the space as well. But like if I identified password spraying as a threat, which here's a little secret, it absolutely is to your organization, then I might say, well, what are we doing to prevent that? Are we training people to use strong passwords? Are we blacklisting certain passwords that we know an attacker is likely to try, like summer 2020 exclamation point? Are we using multi-factor to make it harder to launch that type of attack? Or have we been able to enable passwordless authentication so it's not even, there's nothing to target, right? There's a lot of things on the preventative side that you want to draw out. But on the detective side, what are we doing to detect it? Well, maybe you've got a security information management tool in place that's looking for that type of attack, right? One password launched against all the user accounts in your environment. But what are your third parties doing? Maybe that's a blind spot. So see, now you can start to say, we've got this in hand, we're doing this control, but wait, over here, we've got a gap. And then what are we going to do when we detect it? If you don't know what null routing is, don't jump right in. You might say, if I see somebody doing it, they're definitely bad. I don't want to accept any traffic from their IP. Tread lightly, because you can inadvertently do some damage. But use a mind mapping tool to just start putting order around these threats that you've identified. And then you want to analyze your attack surface, right? You want to get more detail about what's out there above and beyond that kind of attacker's perspective. I do a lot of OSINT gathering between Shodan and Census. you're going to have a pretty good idea of what attackers know you have on the internet. DNS dumpster and find subdomains are a good complement to that. Between those, or among those 4 tools, you get a lot of, these are the systems and ports that are exposed externally. In other words, these are places you can log in if you want to attack us. And then because you work for your organization, you're not limited to passive OSINT. Do some active Nmap scans, right? Do a full port scan of your internet facing systems, right? Don't break anything, but see what ports you can identify that have been exposed externally. See what systems, like non-prod especially, have been exposed externally that you can maybe take offline, and then do just that, right? Before you get too deep into this exercise, right? Even as you go through that first pass of all the threats, and you're doing, maybe say you settle on stride, so you're going through and doing stride for each one and helping to kind of score how bad they look at your environment, in your environment, and how worried you are about them. You can do some cleanup concurrently, right? You don't have to wait until the whole threat modeling exercise is done. If you know you have network ports exposed externally that an attacker could use to try to log into internal systems, but there's no legitimate business purpose, you're allowed to submit a ticket to say, can we close that network port, right? You don't have to wait until you get through your threat modeling exercise if you know that you can, again, reduce your exposure. You can do the same with apps that can either be taken offline if they're exposed externally, or maybe moved internal, hide them behind VPN, or come up with some other way to access them. Maybe put them out one of your cloud environments. Disabling inactive accounts is a gimme, right? If you have accounts that belong to people who don't work at your company anymore, and you don't have any reason, you got to be careful if they've got business processes that someone hard coded their account into. Be delicate with that cleanup, but you can kick that initiative off as soon as you start your threat modeling process. You don't need to wait there. And then reducing privilege, right? Taking away privileges folks don't need if you find that they're over entitled, or if their account has too much access, right? Part of your remediation stage, your stage 3 of addressing your threats, is closing things down. And just as a matter of good hygiene, you know you can do this stuff right away. One of the more challenging things that InfoSec pros have to consider, though, is there is cost and benefit in play here, right? If you look at all the threats you've identified, and you come up with safeguards or controls that you think are going to be useful, if you're going into that with no consideration to cost, then you're going to be sorely disappointed when management or leadership says, yeah, we can't afford that, or we can't justify spending that much money to protect that resource. Now, if it's a matter of physical safety or loss of life, whole different conversation. But there is a cost benefit analysis to be done so that you can determine whether or not you're overspending or underspending on the solutions you're proposing. So bring that to bear when you get to this stage of the process. And then the validation, right? Sooner or later, you've got to go back and I know some of you may know this proverb. It was actually made popular by Reagan in the 80s, right? Trust but verify. That's right. The US president in the 80s was using a Russian proverb. Reasons for that, but I got a separate conversation. Don't just assume that when you tell people, hey, we've gone through the threat modeling exercise, here are the things that we should do. Don't assume that they're just automatically going to get done. You've got to go back and take a look. Those technical scans are going to help some of that if you've taken stuff offline. I would go even deeper. Instead of just like port scans with Nmap, deep authenticated scans. This can actually arguably be pulled forward into the analysis. It's tricky because threat modeling is more of a conceptual exercise, and the amount of the technical resources you bring to bear, it can make the process too cumbersome on the front end. But at some point, you do want that technical data because it's real. It's an actual representation of what your environment looks like. And when it comes to scans, you should absolutely be doing authenticated scans of your hosts, and you should be doing unauthenticated scans of production-facing web apps and authenticated scans of non-production instances of those same web apps. Without an authenticated scan of a web app, you're missing a huge portion of your attack surface. But you can take this data and use it to verify whether or not certain things have been done, and you can also feed it into the next iteration of your threat modeling exercise. You can test whether certain actions have been taken through user awareness training, right? We talked about user interaction being so common with actual attacks against organizations. So through a lunch and learn, whether it's physical, whether it's virtual, through online training, social engineering simulations with tools like Cofense or KnowBe4, Social Engineers Toolkit, still free, out on GitHub, right? Just test and see whether or not users are falling for some of those identity-based attacks, right? When you come up with the threats and say, yeah, we think this is really bad here, you can emulate some of those attacks, exploiting or using those threats as the basis for the attack, and determine how resilient your organization and your users really are. Part of that testing goes above and beyond just basic simulations, though. Deep dive pen test, absolutely. Whether it's internal red team, whether it's a third party that has specialty, deep experience in pen testing, you want to bring that to bear. I'll be a fan of the pen test execution standard till the day I die. It is so good. This little grassroots thing, it just gives you guidance around how to run a pen test. And you can see threat modeling has been considered a part of the pen test standard for, since day one. So if you're engaging a third party to do a pen test, feed them your threat modeling results, right? When you go through that exercise and you've captured all that information, just hand it over and say, this is the stuff we really care about, hammer away. I mean, it may be a more embarrassing report if you look at pen test report that way, but really that's not what pen testing is. It's an education tool. And that's just giving you a significant advantage, right? You're getting so much more value out of the time and money you invest if you're sharing that threat modeling information and having a pen test that actually adheres to that standard. And then a few tools that I'd recommend you actually try on your own to give you some insight into your environment and into an attacker's mindset. Discover is a great OSINT gathering tool. I used to use NTL and Bother, but I know if you pop a set of domain creds and get in and can hit the domain controller, CrackMap exec lets you launch a password spraying attack directly against a DC. Against web interfaces, you could use something like Burp, right? The paid edition of Burp to do a password spraying attack. And Responder is a great little tool that if you're on the internal network, takes advantage of the chattiness of Ethernet to try to get creds. But just a few tools to check out. Again, I've got a lot more in my hacking identity presentation, but when it comes to validation, don't just hand things over, right? Get engaged, roll your sleeves up, give it a try. So what should you do next, right? Now that I'm giving you kind of, here's some methodologies and some resources around methodologies, here's the process. Explore those various threat models and pick one that you want to try, right? Don't try to do too much. Don't try to do everything. Just pick one and say, hey, we're going to go through a threat modeling exercise where we pull some resources out of that NIST doc, and then we sit down with a group of people and try to figure this out. So pick a methodology and draft an identity data flow diagram, not a technical architecture diagram, just a joiner, mover, leaver workflow. How do identities come into that business relationship with your organization? Where do they propagate accounts and entitlements? And how do you manage changes? And what do you do when somebody leaves, right? Just a high level. I've done this in maturity model assessments. I do a lot of assessments of identity programs where I apply the capability maturity model and the Identity Defined Security Alliance framework to help organizations understand what they're doing and how well they're doing identity. And we always front end that conversation with a data flow diagram, just a real simple whiteboard, 20, 30 minutes. It's been eye-opening every single time for the people in the room to say, I did not realize that that's how that works. I thought it was different. So do that at the beginning of your threat modeling exercise, right? Just put that diagram together, vet it with a couple of folks. And then, you've got to put a team together, because you don't want to do this in isolation. You don't want to do it in a vacuum. You want to bring people in from the app side infrastructure, your DevOps team, maybe, legal, right? Maybe audit, maybe human resources, line of business, right? It's going to vary depending on your organization, but it's also a chance to build relationships and help people understand why you're improving your identity infrastructure, why you're making changes to the way they always did things, because you're helping to provide resiliency. You want to make sure they can do their jobs, but you need to understand organizational level, business process level, and information systems level threats so that you can take action to address those threats. And then prototype this threat modeling process by doing it just once. If you pick Stride or you pick Dread as the methodology you want to follow for your first threat modeling exercise, you're not married to it for the next 10, 20 years, right? You can do it once and say, not for us. And then go out to that Carnegie Mellon blog, pick another one. And, just bounce back and forth until you find one that resonates with your team, one that makes sense to your organization. So just do those 4 steps. Take this slide deck. I've got some other resources I recommend. If you don't know Adam Shostak, hit this guy up on LinkedIn, look him up on YouTube. He's got a number of classes on threat modeling on LinkedIn Learning that go into detail. He's even got a book, Designing for Security, that gets into threat modeling. It's going to go into a lot more detail than I can go into in an hour, but Adam's the guy when it comes to threat modeling, and you can learn a lot from what he has to offer. I've got that link here out to the Carnegie Mellon blog, a link to the NIST document, and then, publicly available information is great. If you can get involved in an ISAC specific to your industry, you can get some insider knowledge around threats that people are running into right now. So if your organization doesn't allow you to engage in an ISAC, tell them I said they should, because it's a gimme, right? It's just, you're giving the attackers the advantage if you're not actively engaging in conversation with other professionals in your industry. And if you're a leader, put one of your people on this, right? You're the one who needs to fight for them to get the budget and time to let them do it. The value is absolutely there, but get them engaged. And then the last resource, Lenny Zeltzer's Critical Log Review Checklist for Security Incidents. It's an oldie but a goodie. It gives you some very specific things to look for on the response side that will help you kind of, again, reverse engineer. Well, if I'm seeing this in the SIM and the event logs, then what triggered that, right? What led to that? It's a great resource to help round that out. A couple of other resources here, including the book Identity Attack Vectors from A-Press. It was written by Darren Rolls, who was a former CISO at SailPoint, and Maury Haber over at Beyond Trust. Maury's also got another book, Privileged Attack Vectors, that get into this topic in a lot more detail. And I mentioned I've got my Hacking Identity talk out on the YouTubes. Right there's the link. You go out, pull the one you want out of the list. They all cover the same material. You just get different stories each time. Last but not least, hit me up if you have any questions about this identity stuff, about pen testing, about building a program, about building a strategy. It's all I talk about anymore. And I've got kind of that broad knowledge, but I'm going deep into certain subject areas. I'm an easy guy to find on LinkedIn. It's a social media platform I spend more time on. So reach out to me there. I'll get you a copy of the slides. I'll send any other resources I have. I want to help you be successful. I think, mindset of abundance, right? We can all get better by sharing and learning and teaching. So I want to do my part. Thank you very much for spending time with me on this talk. I hope to hear from you soon. Take care.